The polished brass handle of the door felt cool and unyielding beneath his hand. James Tawara paused for a moment, his reflection a distorted figure in the gleaming metal. He saw the deep, swirling lines of the tomoko on his face, the dark ink, a map of his lineage, his mana, his life. To him, they were a source of immense pride, a connection to the ancestors who walked before him. To others, he knew, they were a question mark, or worse, a full stop. He pushed the door open. A wave of warm air, scented with roasted garlic and expensive perfume, washed over him. The restaurant, the Gilded Spoon, was a symphony of hushed tones and the gentle clinking of silver on porcelain. Soft jazz trickled from hidden speakers. Patrons, dressed in crisp shirts and elegant dresses, occupied tables draped in white linen, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight. It was a world away from the quiet solitude of his home, from the feel of soil under his fingernails and the whisper of the wind through the pohutukawa trees. He had come here tonight for a reason. It was the anniversary of a quiet promise he had made to his late wife, a promise to experience one new, beautiful thing each year on this day. She had loved places like this, places that felt like a celebration. He felt her absence like a physical weight, but her memory was a light, and tonight he was following it. His entrance did not go unnoticed. The low hum of conversation faltered. A fork paused halfway to a mouth. A woman's hand flew to her pearls, her eyes wide. It was a reaction he was accustomed to, but it never lost its sting. The whispers started, quiet as rustling leaves but sharp as thorns. He saw the word form on their lips, even if he could not hear it. Gang. James ignored them. He stood straight, his gaze sweeping over the room not with aggression, but with a quiet appraisal. He wore a simple but well-made dark jacket over a clean-pressed shirt. His silver hair was neatly combed. He carried himself with a stillness that should have spoken of dignity, not danger. But the ink on his skin shouted louder than his posture. A man in a tight black suit, a small officious pin on his lapel identifying him as the manager, detached himself from the bar. He moved with a brisk, self-important stride, his face a mask of practiced politeness that failed to conceal the disdain in his eyes. He intercepted James before he could take 3 steps into the dining room. "Good evening," the manager said, his voice smooth but firm. He positioned himself squarely in James's path, a human barrier. "Can I help you?" The question was not an offer of service. It was a challenge. "I would like a table for one," James replied, his voice a low, calm rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. The manager, whose name tag read Marcus, gave a small condescending smile. He glanced pointedly at James's face, letting his gaze linger on the intricate moko that adorned its chin and jaw. "I'm afraid we have a certain dress code here at the Gilded Spoon." James looked down at his own clean, respectable attire, then back at Marcus. He knew this dance. He knew the steps. "I believe I am within its bounds." "It's not just the clothes, sir," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout in the now silent room. "We have a strict policy, no visible gang insignia, for the comfort and safety of our patrons." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Gang insignia. He had reduced the story of 1,000 years, the artistry of his ancestors, the very fiber of his identity, to a vulgar scrawl on a back-alley wall. James felt a familiar surge of heat, a deep ancestral anger, but he banked it, pushed it down. His wife had taught him the strength of water, how it flows around obstacles, how its quiet persistence can wear down the hardest stone. Anger was fire. It consumed itself. "This," James said, his voice remaining unnervingly level, "is not a gang insignia. This is my heritage." Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like tearing fabric. "That's what they all say. Look, I don't have time for a debate. We are a family establishment. Your facial decorations are intimidating. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The humiliation was a physical thing. It was the collective stare of dozens of strangers, the smug triumph on Marcus's face, the sudden, stark loneliness of being judged and found wanting. He was an elder, a kaitiaki, a man who had lived a life of purpose and service. And here, in this temple of overpriced food and cheap judgment, he was a threat. But he did not move. Leaving would be an admission of guilt. It would be an acceptance of their label. He would stand his ground, not with fists, but with silence. He met Marcus's gaze and held it, his own eyes dark and deep, reflecting the candlelight like a still black lake. The silence stretched. Marcus's smile faltered. He had expected a shouted curse, a defiant gesture, a retreat. He had not expected this quiet, immovable dignity. It unnerved him. This old man wasn't playing by the rules of confrontation. He wasn't giving Marcus the satisfaction of a scene. He was simply being. "Did you hear me?" Marcus snapped, his professional veneer cracking. "I said you need to leave. Now." From a corner table, a man in a tailored suit called out, his voice slurred slightly with wine. "Get him out of here, Marcus. He's ruining the atmosphere." A nervous titter of agreement rippled through the room. The patrons, once silent observers, were now becoming active participants, emboldened by the manager's aggression. Marcus swelled with the support. He was the protector of this gilded cage, the brave gatekeeper holding back the barbarian hordes. He turned to the room at large, raising his voice. "Please, everyone, don't be alarmed. The situation is being handled. The Gilded Spoon prides itself on maintaining a safe and exclusive environment for our valued guests." Each word was a hammer blow against James's composure. Safe, exclusive. He was the situation. He was the danger from which they needed protection. He felt the eyes on him, no longer just curious, but hostile. He could see them picturing him not as he was, an old man wanting a quiet dinner, but as the monster of their imagination, a creature of violence and shadow. Across the room, a young waitress named Chloe stood frozen, a tray of empty wine glasses clutched in her hands. She was new, only a few weeks on the job. She watched Marcus, her boss, and felt a knot of shame tighten in her stomach. She had seen the old man enter. She had seen the quiet grace in his walk, the way he held his head, and she had seen the tattoos. But where Marcus and the others saw a threat, she saw something else. She had an uncle who was a tattoo artist. He had books filled with designs from all over the world. She recognized the style, the flowing lines, the intricate patterns. It wasn't the crude, blocky lettering of a street gang. It was art. It was something ancient and powerful. She looked at the man's eyes, and she saw not malice, but a deep, profound sadness. Marcus turned back to James, his face flushed with power. "For the last time, get out!" James did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply said, "I am here to eat." The sheer audacity of it, the calm refusal to be dismissed, sent Marcus into a sputtering rage. This was a direct challenge to his authority in front of the entire restaurant. He couldn't back down now. He had made this his hill to die on. "That's it," Marcus hissed, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling security. We'll have you removed for trespassing." The threat was clear. It was the final escalation. Humiliation was no longer enough. Now came the threat of physical force, of being dragged out like a common criminal. James watched Marcus dial, his finger jabbing at the screen. He could leave now. He could walk out the door and leave this ugliness behind him. It would be the easy path, but the memory of his wife's voice echoed in his mind. "Stand for who you are, Hemi. Never let them make you small." He stayed. He planted his feet. A silent pohutukawa tree on a windswept cliff, its roots dug deep into the earth, refusing to be moved by the storm. He wasn't just standing for himself anymore. He was standing for his father and his father before him, for every ancestor whose story was written on his skin. He was standing for his culture, for his people, for the very idea that a man could be judged by his character, not by the color of his skin or the ink upon it. The atmosphere in the restaurant had become thick and suffocating. The jazz music had long since faded into the background, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Every patron was watching the drama unfold, their dinners forgotten. They were a captive audience, a jury that had already delivered its verdict. Marcus spoke into his phone, his voice sharp and laced with a theatrical urgency. "Yes, it's Marcus at the front of house. I have a situation. A large, aggressive individual refusing to leave the premises. He's covered in gang tattoos, intimidating the guests. Yes, I need someone down here immediately." Chloe flinched at the description. Large? The old man was of average height, perhaps a bit broader in the shoulders, but hardly imposing. Aggressive? He hadn't moved a muscle. He hadn't raised his voice. He was the calmest person in the room. The lies were so blatant, so self-serving, that they made her feel physically ill. She wanted to say something. She wanted to shout that Marcus was wrong, that this was a cruel mistake. But she was 19. She needed this job. Her tuition was due next month. So she stayed silent, a coward in the corner, clutching her tray of empty glasses like a shield. The shame burned hotter than any anger. Marcus ended the call with a triumphant snap. "Security is on their way, sir," he announced, as if declaring a great victory. "You have one final opportunity to leave under your own power. I suggest you take it." James's eyes never left Marcus's face. He could see the insecurity flickering beneath the bravado. This wasn't about policy. It was about a small man trying to feel big by standing on someone else. James had seen men like Marcus before, in all walks of life. They built their kingdoms on fear and exclusion, and their walls were always brittle. He thought of the fire. The memory came unbidden, hot and sharp. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the smell of burning rubber and gasoline, the screams. He had been driving home from the Maori, the road dark and empty, when the car in front of him had swerved, clipped a barrier, and flipped into a ditch. Flames had erupted from the engine block almost instantly. He hadn't thought. He had just acted. He had pulled over, sprinted toward the wreck, the heat a physical blow. Inside, a young boy was trapped, his leg pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard, his father unconscious in the driver's seat. The flames were licking at the cabin. He had wrenched the door open, the metal searing his hands. He had calmed the terrified child, his voice steady, even as the fire roared around them. He had worked frantically, ignoring the burning debris falling around him, and pulled the boy free just moments before the fuel tank exploded. He still had the scars on his forearms, hidden beneath his jacket sleeves. They were a different kind of Moko, a story written in pain and fire. He had never spoken of it. A good deed is its own reward, his grandfather had taught him. To boast of it was to diminish it. 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the entrance, big men with thick necks and impassive faces. They surveyed the scene, their eyes landing on James as Marcus pointed a trembling finger. "That's him," Marcus said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "He's been asked to leave multiple times. He's trespassing. Remove him." This was it, the final act of the miserable play. The guards began to move forward, their steps heavy and deliberate. The patrons leaned in, eager for the climax. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. James took a slow, deep breath, preparing himself. He would not resist. He would not give them the satisfaction of a struggle. He would walk out with his head held high, his dignity intact, even if they laid hands on him. He looked past the approaching guards toward the gleaming brass handle on the door. He thought of his wife, of her smile. "I tried, my love," he thought. "I tried to find the beauty." And then the door flew open. It wasn't a guard or a late-arriving patron. It was a man in a rumpled suit, his tie askew, his face pale and frantic. He looked like he had run a marathon. He burst into the room, his eyes scanning wildly. This was Mr. Harrison, the owner, a man who usually visited his establishments quietly, unannounced, to observe. Tonight, his arrival was anything but quiet. "What in God's name is going on?" Harrison demanded, his voice a commanding bark that cut through the tension like a knife. He had received a garbled, panicked text from Chloe. "Manager calling security on old Maori man. Please come. It's wrong." He had come fearing a lawsuit, a social media disaster. Marcus's face lit up, seeing his boss. He saw this as his moment of validation. "Mr. Harrison, thank goodness. I'm so sorry you have to see this. I was just handling a security issue. This individual refused to abide by our dress code and was intimidating the guests. I've called security to have him removed." Harrison's eyes followed Marcus's pointing finger. They landed on James Tawara, and the world stopped. The color drained from Mr. Harrison's face. His mouth fell open. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping shock. The air in the room became still and heavy. The 2 security guards froze in their tracks. "You?" Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He ignored Marcus completely, his entire being focused on the old man with the tattooed face. The patrons watched, confused. This was not the reaction they had expected. The manager had been a hero a moment ago. Now he was invisible. Harrison walked slowly, reverently, across the floor. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of James Tawara. The room was so quiet you could hear the flicker of the candles. And then, in an act that defied all logic and expectation for the assembled crowd, Robert Harrison, the wealthy, powerful owner of the Gilded Spoon, dropped to one knee. He bowed his head. The collective gasp from the patrons was a single, sharp intake of breath. Marcus's jaw hung slack, his face a cartoon of disbelief. Chloe opened her eyes, and tears immediately welled in them. Harrison looked up at James, his eyes shining with an emotion so raw, so powerful, it seemed to vibrate in the air. "Mr. Tawara," he said, his voice thick and choked with feeling, "it is an honor to see you again." James looked down at the kneeling man. He recognized him now, not from the restaurant, but from the hospital. The frantic father, his face smeared with soot and tears, who had held his hand and wept with gratitude while his young son lay sleeping in a nearby bed. "Mr. Harrison," James acknowledged, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a new resonance in the silent room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Harrison struggled to his feet, his eyes never leaving James's face. He then turned, and the look of reverent awe on his face transformed into one of pure, unadulterated fury. He fixed his gaze on Marcus. "You," Harrison said, his voice low and trembling with rage. "What did you call him?" Marcus stammered, his world tilting on its axis. He was violating policy, sir. The tattoos, they're gang symbols. He was a threat." "A threat?" Harrison's voice rose to a roar, echoing through the cavernous dining room. He strode over to Marcus, who flinched back as if struck. "A threat? This man?" Harrison spun back to face the entire room, his arms spread wide. "Do you see this man?" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Do you see the man my manager called a gang member? The man you were all so afraid of?" He pointed a shaking finger at James. "Last year, my son Leo was trapped in a burning car. The doors were jammed. The fire was everywhere. I was unconscious. My son was going to die." Tears were now streaming freely down Harrison's face. He didn't bother to wipe them away. This man, this stranger, he ran into that fire. He pulled the door off its hinges with his bare hands. He shielded my son from the flames with his own body and carried him out, seconds before the car exploded. He walked through hell for a boy he had never met. A wave of shock and shame washed over the dining room. The woman with the pearls covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The man who had shouted, "Get him out," sank low in his chair, his face crimson. Every patron, every staff member was forced to confront the ugliness of their own prejudice, their own swift, cruel judgment. "These are not gang symbols," Harrison roared, jabbing his finger toward James's face. "This is a tomoko. It tells the story of his ancestors, his tribe, his mana. It is a mark of honor. And these," he grabbed James's arm, gently pushing up the sleeve of his jacket to reveal the puckered, angry scars of old burns, "these are his other tattoos, the ones he earned saving my son's life." The sight of the scars was a final damning piece of evidence. The truth was undeniable, seared into the man's very flesh. Harrison released James's arm gently, his touch full of reverence. He turned back to Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You stand in my restaurant, a place I built with my own 2 hands, and you spit on the face of the man who saved my son. You call him a threat. You, in your cheap suit and your cheaper prejudices. You dare to judge a man like this?" Marcus was white as a sheet. He tried to speak, to defend himself. "The policy? I was just enforcing the policy for safety." "Safety?" Harrison spat the word out like poison. "The only threat in this room tonight, Marcus, was you. A threat to decency, a threat to kindness, a threat to the very soul of this establishment. You used my restaurant's policy as a weapon for your own bigotry." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Marcus. "You are fired." The words were simple, devastating. Effective immediately, Harrison continued, his voice cold as ice. Collect your personal belongings from your office. The 2 security guards you called to harass this hero will now escort you from the building. You are never to set foot in any of my establishments again. Marcus stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. His carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. The authority he had wielded with such relish was gone. He was nothing. "But, sir," he pleaded. "Get out," Harrison said, his voice final. He gestured to the stunned security guards. "Escort this man out." The guards, their faces grim with the knowledge of the terrible mistake they had almost been a part of, moved to flank Marcus. They placed their hands on his arms, not roughly, but with an inescapable firmness. Marcus, defeated and humiliated, allowed himself to be led away. He didn't look at James. He couldn't. He kept his eyes on the floor as he was paraded past the silent tables, a public spectacle of his own making. As Marcus was marched toward the door, a single sound broke the silence. It was Chloe, clapping. Her hands were trembling. Her face was wet with tears, but she clapped. It was a small, hesitant sound at first, but then another patron joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. It wasn't for Harrison. It wasn't for the drama. It was for James Tawara. It was an apology, a celebration, a desperate attempt to wash away the stain of their collective shame. James stood still amidst the applause, a pillar of calm in the storm of emotion. He looked not at the applauding crowd, but at Mr. Harrison, who now looked exhausted, the adrenaline fading, leaving only a deep, weary gratitude. "Mr. Tawara," Harrison said, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say. I am so sorry, so deeply, profoundly sorry for what happened here tonight. James finally spoke, his voice gentle. "It is not you who needs to apologize." Harrison shook his head. "This is my house. The fault is mine. Please, allow me to make it right. The best table is yours. Anything you want on the house, tonight and for the rest of your life. You will never pay for a meal in any of my restaurants again." He personally took James by the arm and led him through the now parting sea of patrons. He guided him to the best table in the restaurant, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights. He pulled out the chair himself, an act of service and respect that did not go unnoticed. As James sat, Chloe approached the table, her hands twisting the corner of her apron. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry. I saw what he was doing, and I was too scared to speak up. I just sent the text. I should have done more." James looked up at the young waitress, and for the first time that evening, a small, genuine smile touched his lips, making the intricate lines of his mocho seem to dance in the candlelight. He saw not a coward, but a young woman who had wrestled with her conscience and, in the end, had chosen to do the right thing. "You did enough," he said, his voice kind. "You sent for the truth. That is a brave thing to do." Chloe's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She nodded, unable to speak, and hurried away to get him a glass of water. Mr. Harrison lingered for a moment. "Is there anything else I can do? Anything at all?" James looked out the window at the glittering city below. He thought of his wife's promise. He had sought out a beautiful experience, and instead he had found ugliness. But then, out of that ugliness, something else had emerged. Truth, justice, a small measure of understanding in a world that often lacked it. "I would just like to have my dinner," James said quietly. Harrison nodded, finally understanding. He retreated, leaving James in peace. The hum of the restaurant slowly returned, but it was different now. The conversations were more subdued. The glances toward James's table were no longer filled with fear or suspicion, but with a deep, humbling respect. He was no longer an outsider. He was the honored guest, the quiet hero in their midst. From his seat, James could see the front entrance. He watched as the two security guards pushed the door open, flanking the disgraced figure of Marcus. For a moment, Marcus paused on the sidewalk. Looking back through the glass, he saw James, seated at the best table, a glass of water shimmering before him like a jewel. He saw the entire room revolving around the man he had tried to cast out. His face, illuminated by the streetlights, was a mask of utter ruin. Then the guards nudged him forward, and he disappeared into the night. James took a sip of water. The glass was cool, the water clean. He thought of the intricate lines on his face. They told the story of his ancestors, of battles fought and peace made, of land and sea and sky. They told the story of his family, of his wife, of the life they had built. And now perhaps a new line had been etched into his story, invisible to the eye. A line of fire and smoke, of a child's fear and a father's gratitude. A line of prejudice and ignorance overcome by the simple, unassailable power of the truth. He had come seeking beauty. He had found something more. He had found justice. And in its own way, it was the most beautiful thing of all. The waiter arrived to take his order, his head bowed slightly in a gesture of profound respect. James looked at the menu, ready at last to eat.